Thank you very much, Professor. So we are now going to the Q&A session. Please drop all your questions in the Q&A box below, and I will select them and read them out to the professor. Okay, I'm gonna pick a question here by Mr. Haniel Lim here. Professor, I'm going to read it out. He says, "Hi, Professor Kukathas. I was wondering whether you think there are certain cases where collective action may be desirable for immigration. Labor from certain places may be cheap, so there are a lot of workers coming for economic reasons. However, in some cases, an excessive influx may undo the very culture of toleration that welcomes immigrants in the first place. Would it not then be better to force individuals to give up the short-term economic gains of foreign labor in order to sustain long-term social, political, and economic institutions?"
That's a very good question. And I think really this is a question that has to be examined empirically. And I'm very interested in this question. So I've looked for examples of this happening, and I simply don't find any. So there's no empirical evidence to support this worry. But of course, one has to ask, is there any example of a massive influx of immigrants so that we could study to see whether it's destabilizing? So let me give you one such example, which is the movement of East Germans into West Germany when East and West reunified in 1991. Now, if you know anything about the history of communism, you'll recall that the Germanys were separated from 1945 to 1991 because East Germany was ruled under the Soviet bloc. And so it developed a quite distinct set of cultural attitudes. It had a society that was under constant surveillance. It had an anti-capitalist mentality that was created by the regime over a period of 50 years. It had an economy that more or less collapsed. Many of its enterprises had negative value. And so when Germany reunited, not only did it welcome 16 million, in fact, immigrants, but also millions of people literally moved from east to west in 3 or 4 years. Now, what happened to Germany? Well, you could say in one sense, it changed culturally over a period of the last 20 years. It did have all kinds of problems of absorbing people whose attitudes were ones of resentment in many ways. But at the same time, Germany has prospered economically. In that time, it has become the powerhouse of Europe. Its norms of freedom and toleration have, if anything, spread into the eastern parts of Germany, albeit imperfectly. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I don't want to say that there are no problems in Germany. Every country has its problems, but it's a very dramatic case, and it also coincides with a period when Germany accepted thousands, in fact, millions of refugees when it declared itself a refugee and immigrant welcoming country. So if you add all of those, it's closer to 20 million people who moved into Germany over about 10 years. But the effect there was not anything like what one might have feared. Of course, one also has to ask the question when looking at problems that have arisen in Germany since then, when there are problems, to what extent are these problems that are the result of immigration? And to what extent are these problems that have had multiple causes, from the fiscal problems that the European Union has to a whole range of other issues? But looking at this particular case, I just couldn't find any evidence that the theoretical problem that you correctly identify is in fact an actual problem. If we ever get to a point where we suddenly do find there are so many people coming into place that they are causing difficulties, then I think we should look at it. Certainly, it's not something we should just ignore. But for the moment, it's not something that keeps me awake at night.
But Professor, what do you think about, in contemporary Europe today, where nationalists are complaining about the influx of refugees and people from Middle Eastern countries, maybe from Muslim countries who may import illiberal values, and undermine democratic norms and culture, for example, in country of Turkey, for example?
Well, it says again, you couldn't have more illiberal and anti-democratic norms than you had in East Germany, because that is what they were not only brought up with, but they were brought up to explicitly repudiate the capitalist West. Now, most immigrants coming in from other parts of the world, like the Middle East, are in fact not anti-capitalist, but in fact quite the reverse. The ones who want to move are in fact the ones who are most attracted by the West and Western values. It's very, very unusual to find among immigrants actually people who just want to move, for example, for the sake of welfare. Most of them want to move because they want to get ahead economically. So a recent report in the New York Times this last week about the impact of the movement of 1.2 million Syrians that were let in by Angela Merkel suggests that actually most of them have found jobs, most of them have learned German, most of them have assimilated. Of course, a good many haven't as well. There's no denying the problem, but none of the difficulties that have eventuated or that have been anticipated have really eventuated. So I think it's a theoretical problem, but we've yet to see an example in the empirical evidence that makes us think this is an actual problem.
Right. Okay, great. So next question by Soradip Bhattacharya. She says, I was wondering about your views of granting residential rights to immigrants or refugees, but making it conditional on whether they attend and pass a re-education program on Western progressive and liberal values, as is being done with refugees in Sweden, Norway, and other Nordic countries. So it is found that after passing the test and being granted asylum, and if they have not adhered to these values, then will deportation be justified?
Yeah. I think this could set up a very tricky problem for most societies. I'm not sure about Sweden so much, but let's say that you try to do that in the United States or the United Kingdom. In the US in particular, given how divided the society is, I think you're going to have a tough time agreeing on what those values are. Just think about the divided nature of the United States as exhibited by the last election. You're going to have to come to a decision about what is the right set of values. And in a diverse society, these are hotly debated. The other thing, of course, to note is that one of the crucial things about the values of countries like Sweden, for example, is preeminent among these things that are valued is freedom of thought and freedom of speech. So in proposing that people take a test about what they believe, you're actually going against a fundamental strain of the liberal democratic tradition. You can do it, but it seems to me to be very ironic that you would be proposing such a test. And I would imagine that any Swedish national who was asked to take a test like that, even if there were no penalty, would object strenuously and would say, I'm a free Swedish citizen and I have the right to believe what I believe, to think what I think and say what I say.
Right, okay. Next question by Marcos de Souza. Hello, Professor. Would you have any thoughts on the European Union's concept of freedom of movement?
Well, I admire the European Union's view that its internal borders should remain open. And it's maintained that to a substantial degree, but not perfectly, because while the UK was a part of the EU, it was not part of the Schengen Agreement that allowed freedom of movement internally. You still had to cross borders and go through passport control on entering and leaving the UK. But still, I accept that the EU is broadly in favor of freedom of movement internally. And its success in that, I think, is very instructive because it shows you can have freedom of movement without everybody having to worry about people moving from poor countries into rich ones or from one culture into the next in such large numbers that the whole thing falls apart. People have to have reasons to move. So I think all the gains have been substantial and there's been very little negative consequence. On the other hand, what has been noted about the EU's views about free movement is that it doesn't extend to people outside the EU. So it's only freedom of internal movement. So in a sense, it's just become a bit like the United States, where Americans can move freely on their own territory, but outsiders are controlled. And to the extent that the EU wants to prevent outsiders from entering, then it has had to develop a system that exhibits all the pathologies of a regime of immigration control. And in particular, that means that it's set up checkpoints in various parts of the EU within 100 kilometers of all the EU borders. There are patrols who stop people at random to see whether they've broken laws. Mostly they're stopping citizens. They have several hundred detention centers, which contain a good number of European citizens who've been wrongly detained, as well as large numbers of would-be immigrants, both legal and illegal, who are wrongly detained. So I think what I would say about the EU is that it's good in some respects, not so good in others.
Right, okay, next question by KL Chu. Do you think that countries have preferences for certain races over others? President Trump was very uncomplimentary about immigrants, legal or illegal, of Latino ancestry, whilst the Windrush generation of West Indies migrants who migrated to the UK under the right to stay rule in the 1940s or 60s seem to have been especially targeted by the British Home Office, unlike Asian immigrants who came over under the same rules at the same time too.
So there are two separate things to consider here. One is the extent to which the population is full of people who have racial preferences, and the other is the extent to which the governments of these countries, whether the United States or the United Kingdom, have race-based preferences. Now, it's fairly clear that there are some people in any of these countries who have race-based preferences about immigrants. But all of these countries of the liberal democratic West have public philosophies and institutions which repudiate racism and therefore racially biased selection. So the dilemma for governments, therefore, is how to stick to the liberal democratic norms that they profess while not antagonizing those people, and I don't know what proportion they would be of any specific country, those people who want racially shaped immigration selection. Now, that said, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and many others in the world have consistently made racial identity a part of their decision-making in coming to determine who may or may not enter or may not become a citizen. Now here the story is a little bit more complicated than it appears, because the first thing to remember is that there's no such thing as race as a natural category. If you look at the peoples of the world, they shade into one kind or another very, very gradually. If you go to the Middle East and to Africa, you'll see different shades, you'll see subtle differences of language as you move from one region to another, but it's very difficult to say at this point someone becomes this particular kind of racial type. And that's even without thinking about centuries of of intermarriage. So what has made us classify people in this way into different races and sub-races and so on? Well, there are many factors at work, but one of those factors is, in fact, immigration control. Immigration control has led to the creation of racial categories. Did you know, for example, that there was no such category as Asian until 1920? It was a term invented by American legislation when they had to decide how they were going to categorize people when they decided that they were going to have an immigration policy based on nationality. At that point, it was clear that you could not move into a country if you were not, or become a citizen if you were not white. But even that caused a problem because they didn't know what was and what was not white. They knew that African slaves were not white, but what about Punjabis? And what about people who were Parsis, like the parents of Freddie Murphy? Well, in fact, the Supreme Court said that the Parsis were white, but the Punjabis were not. And so over the course of a number of years, the Supreme Court made numerous decisions that tried to establish racial categories. South Africa did the same thing. When it tried to control the movement of Black populations, it started establishing racial categories. First Blacks, coloreds, and whites, and then they added Indians, and then they added various subgroups because they needed to control the movement of the population. Then they needed to figure out how you determine whether someone was white. And they couldn't use biological inheritance because there were too many whites who had some Black ancestry. So they went by appearance. But that didn't work because some siblings were one dark-skinned and one light-skinned. So it all turned into a bit of a mess. Immigration is also a factor that has shaped racial categorization. So the problem is really quite a complicated one. But as I said, you've still got the problem of what you're going to do about those people who want immigration control on the basis of race. And governments have tried to respond to those, but they also then make their own assumptions about races. For example, with the people from the Caribbean versus the people from Asia that the question mentions. Well, in around 1970, the British government decided that it was very worried about all these Asian men coming in to work in the United Kingdom, and they were worried that they might intermarry with the white population. So they set up a visa scheme to allow Asian women to move quickly to join people in the UK using a visa called the fiancé visa. But then they became worried that people would use the fiancé visa, not because they were coming to marry Indian men and stop them marrying white Brits, but that they were just going to use this to come into the country anyway. So they started a process of virginity testing on arrival to see whether the women were virgins. Completely crazy because there's no way of testing such a thing. But they also decided that they didn't need to test the Caribbean people because the Caribbean people were more sexually promiscuous anyway. So, the chances are they weren't virgins. All actually kind of offensive, but the imperative to make judgments about races led to decisions of all kinds about what categorizes or characterizes a race. And many of these things constantly get reified in laws and understandings, which have all kinds of knock-on consequences. So the idea of racial classification as a means of immigration control is fraught with a lot of difficulties. Sorry, Brian, you're muted.
So we have a bunch of questions on Singapore. So Sim Zixuan asks, hi, Professor, do you feel that there is no consensus on a coherent Singaporean identity?
Well, I think if that's being asked by a Singaporean, which I suspect it is, then that's probably correct. But I don't think Singapore would be unique in that respect. I think that's the case with most countries. But I'd actually like to raise a slightly different and prior question, which is actually, what does one mean by the idea of a national identity? So to some extent, there are countries which want to claim that there is a natural national identity that's given by the country's history. And so, all we have to do is look to the past in order to establish it. And all kinds of people have made this claim, but it's turned out to be very difficult to sustain because the past is complicated. There are different streams that crisscross, and historians disagree, and the citizens generally disagree about the past. So it's difficult. In the case of Singapore, that past is very complicated because this region has a long history going back, centuries, if not more than 1,000 years, where there have been different empires. And Singapore was a place within those structures until the British came along and then changed things in a dramatic way to create, the straight settlements that made Singapore a part of a region that could eventually have become Malaysia and did for a while. And then now it's all changed again. So you can't really say, well, we can pluck this clearly out of the past. Perhaps we ought to create one. And I think the Singapore government has a very clear understanding that this is an important thing to do, to create a national identity. The fact that it's still doing this actively suggests that maybe it hasn't succeeded yet. Maybe in time, people will feel that there is a national identity. It's one that everybody shares. But who knows what will happen in the future. It also makes one wonder if everyone stops debating the question of whether there's a national identity. Does that mean now that there is one, or does it mean that there isn't one? I'm not sure how one would interpret this.
So another question on Singapore by Gabriel. Hi, Professor. How can immigrants successfully assimilate or integrate into Singapore society? Should the Singapore state continue to differentially treat low-skilled and high-skilled migrants? For example, issuing policies that attract skilled migrants that make it easy for them to settle down, but not really doing the same for low-skilled migrants?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I've been thinking a lot about this. So one thing I admire about the way the Singapore government has treated its migrant workers is that it's certainly shown them a level of care, and it's given them some recognition as making a contribution to the society. I remember when the PM in the first phase of the lockdown, when he addressed the nation, spoke explicitly to the migrant workers and said, we will protect your livelihoods, we will make sure you can send money home, and we recognize the contribution that you're making. I thought that was very admirable. On the other hand, for them, there's also no path to citizenship, there's no path to integration. So they're really being treated very unequally and differently from those, say, like myself, who've come here as more skilled and well-paid immigrants. I can't help feeling that this is very good for me, but unfair on the others. What is the basis for doing this? I can see that there may be some advantage for Singaporeans because you're getting a lot of low-skill labor. I can see an disadvantage for those immigrants because they wouldn't be coming here unless it was worth their while. It may look like it's low pay to us, but clearly for them, it's better than anything they can get elsewhere. But still, from the perspective of Singapore society, one has to ask, even if we're doing good for these other immigrants, is this the kind of society Singapore wants to be? One that treats people as unequally as this? I think it's a dilemma for Singaporeans.
So one of the last few questions, a general one by Marcos de Souza. How would you define the relationship between capitalism and freedom of immigration?
Very good question. I don't think that there is a straightforward relationship between these two things. Firstly, let me just observe that many non-capitalist countries, although lots going to turn on how much you think that this is capitalism, have accepted far more immigrants and especially refugees than the strongest capitalist democracies. Think, for example, of Iran and Turkey, which are maybe, let's say, highly interventionist capitalist societies, have taken in millions of refugees. So that's a kind of immigration policy, but it's not particularly one that you would associate with a capitalist state. But as I said, it's also a matter of degree. I mean, one thing is clear if you think about the countries of the communist world, or the former communist world. They are hostile both to immigration and emigration. The Soviet Union and China for a long time simply prevented their societies from leaving. But in the case of China, as it's become more capitalist and it's allowed its citizens to travel more freely, it's still much more closed as far as outsiders are concerned. And I think ultimately the reason may be that, what's crucial is not so much the economic system as the kind of political society that you are. If you're a liberal democracy, you're much more likely to enjoy freedom of movement. If you're a society in which control is much more important, especially political control, you're much more likely also to control the movement of people. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I'm just going to end with one last question from myself. So you have presented a very skeptical view against immigration control and showing how it could actually even risk undermining liberal democracy, how it can undermine the freedoms that we cherish. So for you, is there ever a reason or a case for immigration control? When is the most justifiable occasion for the government to control immigration?
Okay. So as I mentioned at the beginning, when you think about immigration control, we're talking not just about controlling borders, but also about controlling what people do once they've entered a society. So to the extent that it's about controlling what people do once they've entered a society, I think there's really very little justification for it, because I don't see any economic benefits. I don't see any security benefits. I don't see any cultural benefits. Think about it in this way. Okay? Each year in the United Kingdom, 30 million visitors enter the country. Okay? Now, only a tiny percentage of those have the right to work, have the right to rent, to have the right to do all kinds of things. Now, if you're worried about the cultural impact of people, then you're allowing all these people in, as well as allowing their ideas and the ideas that come in through the internet and television and so on, which is having a tremendous cultural impact. If you think that you need to control people in order to limit their cultural impact, then it doesn't seem like it's actually a viable strategy, and controlling immigration is not going to do much for you. The same is true for the economic consequences. So then we come to the question of whether there's a case for controlling the borders for immigration at the point of entry. And the only case I can think of is one that's illustrated by the pandemic. There may be times when you need to close your border for reasons of controlling something like a pandemic. But of course, what we've seen in this is that there's nothing actually specifically distinctive about your national borders. Because to control a pandemic, you may well need to control movements between cities, movement between suburbs, movements between houses. Well, this is in a condition of crisis. And of course, what everybody wants is to go back to where we were before, to live as human beings who can move freely within our homes, within our neighborhoods, within our cities, within our countries, and ideally across the world.
Right, okay. With that, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the webinar. Definitely do check out the professor's book on Amazon called Immigration and Freedom. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Feel free to contact us at the Adam Smith Center for more content like this. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everyone.